October 15th, 1976, Philadelphia. Frank DeMarco held the clapperboard as 6-year-old Sarah Chen took her last breath in Sylvester Stallone's arms. The cameras weren't rolling. They never were. What the newspapers called Hollywood's most heartwarming moment was actually the most carefully orchestrated lie in cinema history. Stallone didn't stop filming to comfort a dying fan. He stopped filming because Sarah had seen something she shouldn't have, something that would destroy everything. Frank watched them carry her tiny body away. He watched the studio executives shake hands with her grief-stricken parents. He watched them count the money. 30 years later, when the anonymous letters started arriving with photos from that day, Frank finally understood the truth. Sarah Chen wasn't dying when she arrived on set. She was perfectly healthy, and someone wanted Frank to remember exactly how she really died. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank DeMarco's hands shook as he stared at the envelope in his pickup truck's cab. The Nevada sun beat down through the windshield, but ice ran through his veins. Inside the manila envelope were 3 items that should have been buried with the past: Sarah's hospital bracelet from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, a Polaroid of him standing beside Stallone on the Rocky set, and a single sheet of paper with 4 words typed in courier font. You remember now, Frank? The bracelet was pink plastic with cartoon hearts, the kind they gave to pediatric patients. Sarah's name was printed in faded black ink alongside a date that made Frank's stomach lurch, October 14th, 1976. One day before she died. One day before the lie began. He'd been checking mail at his post office box in Mineral County when the package arrived with no return address, just his name written in block letters that looked deliberately disguised. Now, sitting outside Murphy's Hardware where he'd worked the past 8 years, Frank felt 30 years of carefully constructed numbness cracking like dried leather. The ranch where he lived alone stretched 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. He'd chosen isolation deliberately, trading Hollywood's bright lights for Nevada's endless sky, swapping a career that once mattered for work that kept his hands busy and his mind empty, loading feed, mending fences, breaking horses, honest labor that required no compromises, no looking the other way when powerful people did terrible things. But someone had found him anyway. Frank studied the Polaroid with the magnifying glass he kept in his glove compartment for reading medication labels. The photo showed him in his assistant director uniform, khakis, clipboard, headset around his neck. He stood slightly behind Stallone, who was still in his Rocky Balboa training gear, hands on his hips like he owned the world. In the background, barely visible, was the catering tent where they'd taken Sarah after. He stopped himself. Even now, 3 decades later, he couldn't finish that thought. The photo had been taken by someone with access to the closed set. Studio security had been tight that week because of all the publicity around Sarah's wish. Make-A-Wish Foundation had arranged everything, or so the story went. Dying girl wants to meet Rocky Balboa. Rising star stops production to grant final request. Heartwarming human interest story that would follow Stallone for the rest of his career. Except none of it had been true. Frank remembered the real timeline with sickening clarity. Sarah had arrived on Tuesday morning, October 12th, with her parents and a woman who introduced herself as her caseworker. The girl was small for 6, with bright eyes and nervous energy that made her bounce on her toes when she was excited. She didn't look sick. No pale skin, no thinning hair, no tired movements Frank associated with the genuinely ill children he'd met through various charity events. When he'd quietly asked the caseworker about Sarah's condition, she'd given him vague answers about rare blood disorder and very little time left. But Sarah had eaten 3 hot dogs at craft services, raced around the set asking questions about cameras and lights, and begged to see Stallone throw practice punches until her voice went hoarse. Not the behavior of a dying child. Wednesday had been different. Sarah seemed subdued, staying close to her parents and the caseworker. Frank noticed the adults whispering in corners, making phone calls, checking watches. Stallone himself appeared agitated, snapping at the crew and demanding multiple takes of simple scenes. Thursday morning, everything changed. Sarah was visibly unwell. Pale, shaking, barely able to stand. When Frank asked what was wrong, her father said the excitement had been too much, that her condition was accelerating. The caseworker suggested they film the wish fulfillment scene immediately, before Sarah became too weak to participate. That's when the cameras had stopped rolling, and the real nightmare began. Frank folded the photograph and bracelet back into the envelope, his weathered hand steadier now that decision crystallized in his mind. Someone wanted him to remember. Someone knew he'd been there, seen what really happened, and stayed silent while the machine ground on. The question wasn't who sent the package. The question was what they wanted him to do about it. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Archives Department. Ask about Sarah Chen's medical records. Ask why they don't exist. Frank stared at the message until the screen went dark, then started his truck. The engine turned over with a reluctant growl, and he pulled onto Highway 95 heading south toward Las Vegas. From there, he could catch a red-eye to Philadelphia. 30 years ago, he'd made a choice to survive rather than speak. He'd taken the studio's money, signed their papers, and disappeared into the desert where shame couldn't follow. But shame had found him anyway, wrapped in pink plastic and faded photographs. Someone wanted Frank DeMarco to remember exactly how Sarah Chen had really died, and for the first time in 3 decades, he was ready to stop running from the truth. The truck's air conditioning had given up somewhere outside Tonopah, leaving Frank to drive through the desert heat with windows down and dust coating everything. The manila envelope sat on the passenger seat like a passenger he'd rather not acknowledge, occasionally catching the wind and rustling just enough to remind him of what lay inside. He'd been driving for 2 hours when muscle memory took over and his foot eased off the accelerator. The turnoff to Esperanza Ranch appeared on his right, a weathered wooden sign barely visible against the sagebrush. For 8 years this had been home. Not the sprawling ranch house where the owners lived in Carson City, but the small foreman's cabin tucked behind a stand of cottonwoods where Frank had built something resembling peace. The gravel road stretched for 3 miles before the buildings came into view. First the main barn, its red paint faded to rust brown by decades of Nevada sun. Then the corrals where Frank had spent countless mornings gentling horses that arrived broken from other places. Finally, the cabin itself, 4 rooms and a covered porch where he'd sat every evening for 8 years, watching the sun disappear behind mountains that had been here long before Hollywood existed. Isabella was waiting for him. The old mare stood at the fence line near the cabin, her gray head lifted as if she'd been watching the road. Frank had found her 3 years ago wandering Highway 6, ribs showing through a coat matted with neglect. No brand, no owner who came looking. She'd been somebody's discarded mistake, and Frank had recognized a kindred spirit. He parked the truck but left the engine running, the decision to continue to Las Vegas still fragile in his mind. Isabella nickered softly and walked to the gate, her movements stiff with age but her dark eyes alert. Frank stepped out into air that smelled of dust and distant rain, the kind of approaching storm that might break the heat or might just tease them with empty clouds. "Hey, girl!" His voice came out rougher than expected. He reached through the fence rails to stroke her neck, feeling the solid warmth of her beneath weathered fingers. "Didn't expect me back so soon, did you?" Isabella's ears flicked forward, and Frank found himself studying her face. Horses didn't lie. They didn't scheme or cover up or take money to forget what they'd seen. When they trusted you, it meant something. When they stayed close, it was choice, not calculation. The cabin door stood open, screen door moving slightly in the breeze. Frank had left it that way this morning when he'd driven to town for supplies, back when the biggest concern in his life was whether Murphy's Hardware had the right gauge wire for the south pasture fence. The mundane worry seemed absurd now, like remembering a childhood game while standing at a funeral. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. Coffee cup in the sink, unopened mail stacked on the kitchen table, bills and ranch supply catalogs, nothing that couldn't wait. The bed was made with military precision, a habit from his Navy days that even 30 years of civilian life hadn't broken. Everything in its place, everything controlled, everything safe. Frank walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the landscape he'd grown to love. The ranch stretched to the horizon in gentle swells of brown grass and scattered brush, broken only by fence lines and the distant ridge where deer came down to drink from the stock tank at dawn. He'd watched that same view through 4 seasons for 8 years, finding comfort in its consistency. The land didn't change, didn't judge, didn't ask questions about who he'd been before he arrived, with nothing but a battered suitcase and references that barely checked out. His neighbor's dog started barking somewhere to the north, a sound that carried for miles in the thin air. Probably just a coyote or maybe cattle that had wandered through a gap in the fence. Normal ranch sounds, normal problems with normal solutions. Frank had built his life around normal, around predictable rhythms that kept the past buried where it belonged. The envelope in his truck seemed to pulse with malevolent energy even from this distance. Isabella whinnied again, a sound that held more urgency this time. Frank returned to the fence and found her watching him with what looked uncomfortably like concern. She'd been abandoned once already. She understood about people who disappeared without explanation, about lives that shattered without warning. "I might have to go away for a while," he said quietly, the words feeling like confession. "If I do, Martinez will take good care of you. He's got that big spread up near Reno, plenty of grass, other horses for company." The mare's ears flattened slightly, and she stepped closer to the fence. Frank reached into his pocket for the peppermints he always carried, watching her gentle lips work the candy from his palm. Such a small thing, but it anchored him to this moment, this place, this version of himself that had learned to sleep without nightmares. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "Flight leaves Vegas at 11:47 p.m. Seat 14A already reserved. Time to stop hiding, Frank." Someone wasn't just watching. Someone was planning. Frank's phone buzzed a third time before he could process the implications of someone booking his flight. The screen showed another message. "Answer the phone, Frank. We need to talk." The phone rang immediately after, the sound sharp and alien in the desert quiet. Frank stared at the unknown number, his thumb hovering over the decline button. Isabella shifted restlessly at the fence, sensing his agitation. On the 4th ring, he answered. Frank DeMarco. His voice came out steady despite the hammering in his chest. "Hello, Frank." The voice was female, middle-aged, with the kind of careful diction that came from years of choosing words precisely. "My name is Dr. Catherine Walsh. I was Sarah Chen's physician at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia." The peppermint fell from Frank's nerveless fingers. Isabella snorted and stepped back as he gripped the fence rail hard enough to feel splinters bite into his palm. "That's impossible," he said. "Sarah's doctor was Dr. Marcus Webb. Yes, I know. That's what the paperwork said. But I was the one who actually treated her, Frank. I was the one who questioned why a healthy 6-year-old was being admitted for terminal cancer. I was the one who tried to stop what happened to her." Frank's legs felt unsteady. He leaned against the fence, watching heat shimmer rise from the desert floor. "You sent the package. I've been trying to find you for 3 years, moving around like you do, paying cash, using different names. You've gotten good at disappearing, but you kept the same social security number for your ranch work. Sloppy, Frank. What do you want?" "Justice." Finally. Her voice carried 30 years of suppressed anger. "I want the truth about what they did to Sarah. And I want the people responsible to pay for it." Frank closed his eyes, but the desert heat couldn't burn away the memory that surfaced. Sarah on that final day, too weak to stand, her small hand reaching for his as they wheeled her toward the catering tent. He'd thought it was compassion when Dr. Webb suggested keeping her comfortable, away from the cameras. He'd thought the injection was for pain. "I was just an assistant director," he said. "I didn't know." "You knew." Dr. Walsh's voice cut through his denial like a scalpel. "Maybe not everything, but you knew something was wrong. You saw her medical files, didn't you? The ones that disappeared the day after she died?" Frank had seen them. He'd been looking for Sarah's emergency contact information when she became ill, and he'd glimpsed enough to know the numbers didn't add up. White blood cell count normal, tissue samples negative, brain scans clear. The file of a healthy child, not a dying one. "They paid you to forget," Dr. Walsh continued. $50,000, wasn't it? Plus the promise of steady work if you kept quiet. But they fired you 6 months later anyway, once the story died down. The exact amount made Frank's stomach lurch. Someone had access to records that should have been sealed, destroyed, or buried in legal files he'd assumed would never surface. "How do you know about the money?" Because I've been investigating this for 30 years, Frank. Every person who was on that set, every document that survived the studio's cleanup, every lie they told to cover their tracks. You weren't the only one who took their money, but you might be the only one still alive who saw what really happened in that tent. Frank thought about the other people who'd been there that week. Jerry Morrison, the cinematographer, had died in a car accident 2 years later. Linda Hayes, the craft services coordinator, had overdosed in 1981. Marcus Webb himself had suffered a heart attack in 1995. All of them gone, all of them silenced. Why now? Frank asked. Why after all these years? Because I'm dying, Frank. Pancreatic cancer. I have maybe 4 months left, and I'm not taking this secret to my grave. Sarah deserved better than what they did to her. Her parents deserved the truth about why their daughter really died. Her parents are dead. Her sister isn't. Christine Chen Nakamura, 38 years old, living in Sacramento with 2 daughters of her own. She's been looking for answers about what happened to Sarah since she was old enough to understand that the official story didn't make sense. Frank felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses crumble. The life he'd built in Nevada, the peace he'd found with the horses and the desert silence, the 8 years of honest work that had almost made him forget he'd once been the kind of man who stayed quiet while children died. All of it was dissolving like salt in water. The flight to Philadelphia, he said. Leaves at 11:47. Your boarding pass is at the United counter under your real name. I'll meet you at the hospital tomorrow morning. We're going to find Sarah's real medical records, Frank, the ones I hid before they could be destroyed. The line went dead. Frank stood in the Nevada heat, holding a silent phone, while Isabella watched him with dark eyes that seemed to understand everything. 30 years of running was over. The past had finally caught up. Frank stood motionless for several minutes after the call ended, his hand still gripping the phone like an anchor. The silence that followed Dr. Walsh's words felt different from the desert quiet he'd grown to love. This was the silence of held breath, of decisions that couldn't be unmade. Isabella nickered softly and nudged his shoulder through the fence. The gentle contact broke his paralysis, and Frank's training kicked in. He'd learned long ago that when the past came calling, you had 3 choices: run farther, fight it, or pretend it wasn't happening. He'd spent 30 years running. Fighting seemed impossible, which left denial. He walked back to the truck and grabbed the manila envelope, then carried it to the burn barrel behind the barn where he disposed of ranch trash. The metal drum was still warm from yesterday's fire. Frank struck a match and held it over the envelope, watching the small flame dance in the desert breeze. The rational part of his mind insisted this was the smart choice. Dr. Walsh was dying. 4 months, she'd said. Without him, she had no witnesses, no proof, just the word of a disgraced doctor against a Hollywood legend. Let her take her theories to the grave. Let sleeping monsters lie. The match burned down to his fingers, and Frank hissed and dropped it. The envelope remained unburned. He tried again with a second match, but his hand refused to obey. The image of Sarah's face kept surfacing, not pale and sick as she'd been at the end, but bright and laughing as she'd been that first day, asking endless questions about movie magic while demolishing hot dogs at craft services. Frank's phone rang again, jarring him from the memory. He expected Dr. Walsh's number, but the caller ID showed Martinez Ranch. Frank? Thank God. Eduardo Martinez's voice carried an edge Frank had never heard before. You need to get out of there. Now. What are you talking about? Some men came by here an hour ago asking about you. 3 of them in a black SUV with California plates. They said they were federal investigators, but their badges looked wrong. And they knew things, Frank. About your time in Hollywood, about why you left. Frank felt ice form in his stomach despite the desert heat. What did you tell them? Nothing. Told them I barely knew you, just hired you for seasonal work. But Frank, they weren't buying it. They asked about your habits, your schedule, whether you had family. The kind of questions people ask when they're planning something. The burn barrel suddenly seemed inadequate. Frank scanned the horizon, looking for dust clouds or the glint of sunlight on windshields. The desert that had felt like protection now felt like exposure. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run except the single road that led back to the highway. Which direction were they headed when they left your place? South toward your ranch. But Frank, that was 40 minutes ago. Frank killed the call and ran for his cabin. 30 years of careful living had taught him to keep emergency supplies ready. Cash, fake ID, a go bag with 3 days of supplies. He grabbed everything from his hiding place beneath the floorboards, his movements efficient despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Through the kitchen window, he could see Isabella still standing at the fence, watching him with those dark eyes that missed nothing. The sight of her trusting face made his chest tighten. Horses didn't understand betrayal, didn't know that the people they depended on sometimes disappeared without warning. Frank's hands shook as he threw clothes into a duffel bag. This was exactly what had happened in 1976, the moment he'd realized the machine was bigger than him, that people who asked too many questions or knew too much simply vanished from the story. He'd taken their money and ran then, because the alternative was ending up like Jerry Morrison, wrapped around a tree on a straight stretch of highway. His phone buzzed with a text. "Still time to catch that flight, Frank. Don't make the same mistake twice." Dr. Walsh was right about one thing. He had made a mistake 30 years ago. But which mistake? Taking the money and staying silent, or not running far enough? Frank carried his bag to the truck, then stopped at Isabella's fence. The old mare approached slowly, her head extended as if she sensed something wrong. He reached through the rails one last time to stroke her neck, memorizing the warm solidity of her. "Martinez will take good care of you," he whispered. "He's a good man." But as Frank climbed into his truck and started the engine, he realized he wasn't driving toward Las Vegas and the airport. Instead, he found himself turning north toward the highway that would take him deeper into Nevada, farther from Philadelphia and Dr. Walsh's demands for justice. Some truths were too dangerous to tell. Some secrets were meant to stay buried. The last thing Frank saw in his rearview mirror was Isabella standing alone at the fence, watching him disappear just like everyone else had always done. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, broken asphalt shimmering in the late afternoon heat. Frank had been driving for 2 hours, his truck eating miles toward nowhere in particular, when the first roadblock appeared. Nevada State Police. 2 cruisers angled across both lanes, officers in mirrored sunglasses directing traffic to a single-lane detour through the desert. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he approached, forcing his breathing to stay steady. Routine traffic stop. Construction ahead. Nothing to do with him. The officer who approached his window was young, maybe 25, with the eager efficiency of someone still proving himself. "License and registration, please." Frank handed over the documents, noting how the officer's eyes lingered on his face, comparing it to something. A photograph, a description. The silence stretched too long. "Where you headed today, Mr. DeMarco?" The question should have been casual, but it wasn't. Frank had heard that tone before, careful, probing, designed to elicit information rather than make conversation. "Reno," Frank lied smoothly. "Visiting family." The officer studied his license again, then walked back to his cruiser. Frank watched in his side mirror as the man spoke into his radio, the conversation animated and lengthy, too lengthy for a routine check. When the officer returned, his demeanor had shifted. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." "Is there a problem?" "Just routine." "Please, step out." Frank complied, his mind racing through options. The desert stretched in all directions, offering no cover, no escape routes. 2 more officers had materialized, flanking him with practiced precision. "This wasn't random. We're going to need to search your truck," the first officer said. "You can make this easy or difficult." "I know my rights," Frank said. "You need probable cause or a warrant." The officer smiled without warmth. "Anonymous tip about drug trafficking. That's all the probable cause we need." They found his emergency cash first, $15,000 in small bills, vacuum-sealed and hidden behind the spare tire. Then the fake ID, the disposable phone, the detailed maps of back roads through 3 states. Everything that made Frank look exactly like what he was, a man running from something. "Looks like our anonymous tipster was right," the officer said, bagging the evidence. "You're under arrest for suspicion of money laundering and drug trafficking." The handcuffs bit into Frank's wrists as they loaded him into the back of a cruiser. Through the wire mesh, he watched his truck being loaded onto a flatbed tow truck with California plates. The same plates Martinez had described. The Tonopah County Sheriff's Department was a squat concrete building that looked like it had been dropped into the desert by accident. Frank sat in an interview room for 3 hours before anyone spoke to him, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like angry insects. The walls were painted institutional green, and the metal table was scarred with the desperation of previous occupants. When the door finally opened, Frank expected another young officer. Instead, a man in an expensive suit entered, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of getting what he wanted. "Mr. DeMarco, I'm Agent Morrison with the FBI." He settled into the chair across from Frank with practiced ease. "Though I suspect you know why I'm here." The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Morrison. "Jerry was my brother." The man's voice was conversational, but his eyes were winter cold. "Funny thing about car accidents, they're only convincing if nobody looks too closely. But I've been looking very closely for 30 years. Frank's mouth went dry. "Your brother died in 1978. Single car accident on Highway 101. After he started asking questions about what really happened to Sarah Chen, after he found inconsistencies in the medical timeline, after he threatened to go public with what he'd discovered." Morrison leaned forward. "You were there that last week, Frank. You saw everything. What did they do to that little girl?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Morrison opened a manila folder and spread photographs across the table. Crime scene shots of Jerry Morrison's car twisted around an oak tree, medical examiner reports, police interviews that had been buried in departmental files for decades. "My brother was a careful driver. Didn't drink, didn't use drugs, but the night he died, his blood alcohol was. And they found cocaine residue in his system." Morrison's finger tapped one of the photos. Except the injection site was in his neck, hidden by the seatbelt. "Someone drugged him, Frank. Someone made sure he couldn't tell the world what Stallone and his people had done." Frank stared at the photographs, seeing his own future reflected in the twisted metal. "Why are you telling me this?" "'Cause Dr. Walsh contacted you. Because she's forcing the issue. And because the same people who killed my brother are cleaning house again." Morrison gathered the photos. 3 people who worked on that Rocky set have died in the last 6 months. All natural causes, officially. Heart attacks, strokes, sudden illnesses. But when you've been tracking a pattern for 30 years, you start to see the connections. The room seemed to shrink around Frank. "What do you want?" "The truth. Before they silence you permanently." Morrison stood, straightening his suit jacket. "Dr. Walsh is already dead, Frank. Died this morning in her hotel room. Sudden heart failure, according to the preliminary report. Just like the others." Frank's world tilted. The woman who'd called him, who'd spent 30 years seeking justice for Sarah Chen, was gone, and with her, any hope that the truth would ever surface. "So now it's just you," Morrison continued, "the last witness to whatever happened in that tent. How long do you think you'll last once they find you?" Frank stared at the empty space where Morrison had stood, the weight of isolation crushing down on him like desert stone. Dr. Walsh dead. Her 30-year quest for justice snuffed out with surgical precision. The woman who'd called him yesterday morning, alive, angry, determined, was now another heart attack statistic. "You're lying," Frank whispered to the empty room. But even as he said it, the pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The roadblock had been too convenient, too perfectly timed. The anonymous tip about drug trafficking. Morrison's arrival with FBI credentials that Frank suddenly doubted were real. Everything orchestrated to get him isolated, contained, controllable. The door opened again, and a different man entered, younger than Morrison, wearing the kind of casual clothes that screamed federal agent trying to look approachable. He carried a tablet and a thick manila file. "Mr. DeMarco, I'm Agent Richardson. I understand Agent Morrison has been filling you in on our investigation." "Investigation into what?" Richardson settled into the chair Morrison had vacated. 30 years of murder disguised as coincidence. "Your friend Dr. Walsh was getting too close to something that powerful people want to stay buried." Frank watched Richardson's face, searching for tells, for the subtle signs of deception he'd learned to recognize during his Hollywood years. But the man seemed genuinely concerned, genuinely invested in finding truth rather than burying it. "How do I know you're really FBI?" Richardson slid his credentials across the table. Unlike Morrison's, these felt substantial, authentic. The badge was warm from being carried in a pocket, the ID photo slightly worn at the edges, details that were hard to fake. Because if I wasn't, you'd already be dead. Richardson opened his tablet and showed Frank a news article. Dr. Margaret Walsh, 67, found dead in Philadelphia hotel room, apparent heart failure, no signs of foul play. The photograph showed a woman Frank recognized from her voice, thin, determined, with the kind of fierce intelligence that burned in her eyes even through newsprint. The article was dated this morning, just hours after their phone call. They moved fast, Richardson continued, but not fast enough. Dr. Walsh had been feeding us information for months. We have copies of everything she'd uncovered, medical records, witness statements, financial documents showing payments to silence potential witnesses, including my payment. $50,000, plus the promise of steady work that never materialized. Richardson leaned forward. They used you, Frank. Fed you just enough truth to make you complicit, then cut you loose when you were no longer useful. Frank felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. For 30 years he told himself he'd been a willing participant, that he'd taken the money with full knowledge of what it meant. It had been easier to believe he was complicit than to admit he'd been manipulated. I thought I was protecting everyone, Frank said slowly. The production, Stallone's career, even Sarah's family. They told me that going public would only cause more pain. Who told you that? Frank closed his eyes, remembering. Marcus Webb, Stallone's personal physician. He said Sarah was dying anyway, that revealing the complications would only tarnish her memory and destroy the good that came from her story. Richardson's fingers danced across his tablet. Dr. Marcus Webb died in 1995. Heart attack. But before he died, he made a confession to his priest. A confession that Father Kowalski reported to authorities 3 days ago, after his own conscience finally couldn't bear the weight. The tablet screen showed a scanned document, handwritten, signed, notarized. Frank could see his own name mentioned multiple times in the faded ink. What did he confess? That Sarah Chen wasn't dying, that her cancer was in complete remission, that she was a healthy 6-year-old, whose only crime was asking too many questions about how movie magic worked. Richardson's voice hardened. They killed her to create a story, Frank. Murdered a child to generate publicity for a movie that was struggling to find an audience. The words hit Frank like physical blows. Sarah's bright face floated in his memory, not the pale, weakened child from those final days, but the vibrant girl who'd arrived on set, bursting with excitement and endless curiosity. That's impossible. I saw her medical files. Forged Webb was a licensed physician. It wouldn't have been difficult to create convincing documentation of a terminal illness that didn't exist. Frank's hands began to shake. The injection Webb gave her that final day wasn't for pain. According to his confession, it was potassium chloride. Causes cardiac arrest that's nearly impossible to distinguish from natural causes, especially in a child already documented as terminally ill. The interview room walls seemed to be closing in. Frank had watched them murder Sarah Chen, had helped them cover it up, had taken their money and stayed silent while a child's killer became America's sweetheart. Stallone knew, Frank said. It wasn't a question. Richardson nodded grimly. According to Webb's confession, it was Stallone's idea. The silence that followed Richardson's words stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Frank felt his 30 years of carefully constructed justifications crumble into dust. Sarah's face haunted the fluorescent-lit air between them. Not the pale, supposedly dying child, but the vibrant 6-year-old who'd peppered everyone with questions about camera angles and special effects. I need to see Webb's confession, Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richardson slid the tablet closer. Frank read each line with growing horror, watching his own memories recontextualized through Webb's guilt-ridden prose. The doctor described Stallone's desperation as Rocky struggled to find its audience, the studio's threats to pull funding, the publicity team's calculation that nothing sold tickets like a heartwarming story of a star's compassion. Sarah was chosen specifically because she was recovering, Frank read aloud, healthy enough to be energetic and engaging on camera, but with a recent medical history that could be manipulated to support the narrative. Keep reading. Frank's hands trembled as he scrolled down. Webb's confession detailed every horrific moment of that final week, how they'd slowly introduced fake symptoms, coached Sarah to appear weaker, even drugged her lightly to create the pallor that convinced everyone she was fading. The injection that killed her had been administered while Frank was distracted, sent on an errand to fetch coffee for the gathered crew. I was supposed to witness her death, Frank realized. That's why they kept me close. They needed someone credible to confirm she died peacefully, surrounded by love. And you played your part perfectly, Richardson said without judgment. Your testimony to the media was what sold the story. Your grief was real, which made it convincing. Frank pushed the tablet away, unable to read more. The weight of his unwitting participation crushed down on him like a physical force. He'd mourned Sarah genuinely, had carried the pain of watching a child die for 30 years. But that pain had been built on a lie. She hadn't died from cancer. She'd been murdered while he fetched coffee. There's more, Richardson said gently. Webb's confession includes details about the others who knew or suspected the truth. Journalists who were bought off, crew members who were relocated, studio executives who were promoted to keep them quiet, and the ones who couldn't be bought, Jerry Morrison. Among others, a makeup artist named Linda Torres died in 1982. Accidental drug overdose, officially. A gaffer named Mike Hendricks died in 1985. Car accident. A publicist named Rachel Stone died in 1989. Suicide. Richardson's voice grew harder with each name. All of them had been asking questions. All of them had pieces of the truth. Frank felt the walls closing in. How many people have died to protect this secret? We've identified 17 suspicious deaths over 30 years, all connected to that rocky set. All people who might have threatened the narrative. Richardson leaned back in his chair. Dr. Walsh would have been 18. You're being positioned to be 19. The casual way Richardson stated Frank's impending death sent ice through his veins. What do you want from me? Everything you remember, every detail, every conversation, every moment from that week. We're building a case that can finally bring justice for Sarah and all the others. Richardson's eyes burned with intensity. But more than that, we're trying to keep you alive long enough to testify. Frank laughed bitterly. You think I'm safe here? Morrison walked right in, claimed to be FBI. How do I know they don't have people in your organization too? Because Morrison isn't FBI, Richardson said quietly. His real name is Vincent Marcello. He's worked private security for Stallone's organization for 20 years. His job is to identify and eliminate threats to his employer's reputation. The revelation hit Frank like a sledgehammer. The man claiming to be Jerry Morrison's brother had been playing him from the moment he walked in. Every word about seeking justice had been a lie designed to gauge how much Frank knew, how much threat he represented. He's probably reporting to Stallone right now, Frank said. Which is why we need to move fast. Richardson stood, gathering his files. We have a safe house in Nevada, off the grid. You can finish Webb's confession there. Help us understand exactly what happened in that tent. Frank stared at the confession on the tablet screen. Webb's handwritten words blurring through tears he hadn't realized were falling. Sarah Chen had died not from cancer, but from Hollywood's hunger for publicity. She'd been sacrificed to create the legend of Sylvester Stallone's compassion. Her murder disguised as natural death while Frank unknowingly helped sell the lie to the world. What about the others? Frank asked. The ones you said died recently? Richardson's expression darkened. They're accelerating the timeline. Someone's forcing their hand, making them clean up loose ends they've ignored for years. He paused at the door. The question is whether you're going to be another victim or finally help us stop them. Frank looked one last time at Sarah's name in Webb's confession, remembering her laugh, her endless questions, her trust in the adults around her. I'll testify, he said. The safe house was a weathered ranch 40 miles outside Tonopah, hidden in a valley between barren hills that stretched endlessly under the Nevada sun. Frank sat at a scarred wooden table. Richardson's laptop open before him, typing his own confession with trembling fingers. Each word felt like pulling glass from an old wound. Sarah Chen arrived on set Tuesday morning, March 15, 1976. She was vibrant, healthy, asking questions about everything. The cameras, the lights, how they made fake blood. Not the dying child we later claimed she was. The screen door banged open. Richardson entered with 2 FBI agents Frank hadn't seen before, their faces grim. "We have a problem," Richardson announced. "Stallone's people found Dr. Walsh's hotel room before we could secure her evidence. Whatever she'd gathered over 30 years, it's gone." Frank's fingers stilled on the keyboard. "What does that mean?" "It means your testimony is the only thing left connecting Stallone directly to Sarah's murder." One of the new agents, a woman with steel-gray hair, pulled out a chair. "I'm Agent Santos. We need to accelerate your timeline." Before Frank could respond, his old flip phone, the one he'd kept hidden for emergencies, began ringing from his jacket pocket. The agents tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. "That phone's been dead for months," Frank said, staring at the pocket. Richardson nodded to Santos, who carefully extracted the device. The screen showed an unknown number. "Answer it," Richardson said. "But keep him talking." Frank accepted the phone with shaking hands. "Hello?" "Frank." The voice was older now, deeper, but unmistakably familiar. "It's been a long time. Silvester Stallone, the man whose career Frank had unknowingly helped build on a child's grave." "I know what you're thinking," Stallone continued before Frank could speak. "That I'm some monster, that I killed an innocent girl for publicity. But you were there, Frank. You saw Sarah deteriorating day by day. You know she was dying." "No." Frank's voice cracked. "I read Webb's confession. Sarah was healthy. You murdered her." A long pause. When Stallone spoke again, his famous rasp carried genuine pain. "Webb was losing his mind at the end, cancer eating his brain, making him confess to sins that existed only in his guilt-ridden imagination. Frank, I held that little girl while she died. I felt her slip away. Cancer took her, not me." The conviction in Stallone's voice shook Frank. For a moment, 30 years of buried memories wavered. Had he been wrong? Had Webb's deathbed confession been the product of a diseased mind rather than guilty conscience? Richardson was making urgent gestures, pointing to his watch. "Keep him talking." "Then why are people dying?" Frank asked. "Why did Jerry Morrison die in 1978? Why did Dr. Walsh die yesterday?" "Because sometimes truth gets complicated. Because people see conspiracies where there are only sad coincidences." Stallone's voice hardened slightly. Morrison was drinking. Frank had been for months after losing Sarah. And Dr. Walsh? She was obsessed. 30 years of chasing ghosts made her dangerous to herself and others. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Think about what you actually witnessed. Not what Webb claimed, not what these federal agents are telling you. What did you see with your own eyes?" Frank closed his eyes, forcing himself back to that tent. Sarah on the cot, pale and weak. Webb administering the injection, the monitors showing her heart stopping, his own tears as he realized she was gone. But there had been something else. Something he'd buried so deep it had taken 30 years to resurface. "I saw you arguing with Webb," Frank whispered, "right before the injection. You were angry about something." Silence on the line. "Then, you saw what you needed to see to tell the story we needed told." The admission hit Frank like a physical blow. Not a confession of murder, but something almost worse. Confirmation that Sarah's death had been choreographed, performed, used. Whether she'd died from cancer or potassium chloride mattered less than the fact that Stallone had turned a child's death into a publicity opportunity. "Where are you?" Frank asked. "Close enough. Frank, this ends one of two ways. You walk away, like you did 30 years ago, and live quietly with your memories. Or you keep talking to federal agents and join the others who couldn't let the past stay buried." Richardson was frantically signaling. They were tracing the call. "I can't walk away," Frank said. "Not anymore. Sarah deserves better. Sarah is dead." Stallone's voice went cold. "She's been dead for 30 years. Nothing you do now changes that. But it changes what happens next." The line went dead. Richardson grabbed his radio, barking coordinates to units in the field. Through the ranch house windows, Frank could see dust clouds rising from the valley floor, vehicles approaching fast. "They found us," Richardson said grimly. Frank looked down at his half-finished confession on the laptop screen. 3 paragraphs. A lifetime of guilt reduced to incomplete sentences. Not enough to bring justice, but maybe enough to finally tell the truth. He began typing faster. The gunfire started at sunset. Frank's fingers flew across the keyboard as bullets shattered the ranch house windows, his confession growing with desperate urgency while federal agents returned fire from behind overturned furniture. Glass crunched under boots, someone screamed. But Frank kept typing, Sarah Chen's story pouring out of him like blood from a 30-year-old wound. They killed her while I fetched coffee, used her death to sell tickets, made America fall in love with a lie. Frank. Richardson's voice cut through the chaos. We need to move. But Frank couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Not when he was finally so close to giving Sarah the truth she deserved. His fingers found a rhythm even as the world exploded around him. 30 years of silence transformed into sentences that might outlast whatever happened in the next few minutes. A figure appeared in the doorway. Vincent Marcello, the man who'd claimed to be Jerry Morrison's brother, raised his weapon with professional calm. Frank hit send just as the bullet took him. 6 months later, the Nevada cemetery was smaller than Sarah Chen's final resting place in Los Angeles, just a wind-scoured plot overlooking the valley where Frank DeMarco had spent his last peaceful years. Agent Richardson stood beside the fresh headstone, reading the inscription, Francis DeMarco, 1954 to 2024. The case had made headlines for 3 weeks. Stallone's arrest, the exhumation of Sarah's body, the congressional hearings about Hollywood's culture of silence. DNA evidence from Webb's confession had confirmed potassium chloride residue in Sarah's remains. 17 suspicious deaths over 30 years suddenly had context, meaning justice. But the media had moved on, as media always did. Other scandals, other tragedies. The public's attention was finite, and Frank's story had already faded into the background noise of a world that consumed truth like entertainment and forgot it just as quickly. Richardson placed a single white lily beside Frank's headstone, the same flower that had decorated Sarah's hospital room in that final photograph. Frank's confession had survived, uploaded to servers across 3 continents before Marcello's bullet found its mark. 27 pages of testimony that had torn down one of Hollywood's most enduring legends and revealed the small girl who died to create it. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the empty cemetery. In the distance, the ranch where Frank had lived his final years stood abandoned, windows boarded, a for sale sign creaking in the desert air, no buyers yet. Places where truth finally emerged often carried a weight that kept people away. Richardson's phone buzzed. Another case, another victim, another truth that needed excavating from the places where powerful people buried their sins. He took one last look at Frank's grave, remembering the man's shaking hands as he typed his confession while bullets flew. The absolute determination to finish what he'd started, to give Sarah Chen the voice that had been stolen from her 30 years ago. Justice had come slowly, imperfectly. Stallone would die in prison, but he was 78 years old. The studio executives were dead or beyond prosecution. The publicity machine that had turned a child's murder into a marketing campaign had long since moved on to other victims, other lies. But Sarah's story was finally true. Her real story, not the sanitized version that had sold millions of movie tickets, but the messy, horrible, honest account of how a 6-year-old girl's trust had been repaid with betrayal. Frank's confession had given her back her voice, her name, her right to be remembered as more than a prop in someone else's legend. Richardson drove away as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving Frank's grave in shadow. In Los Angeles, tourists still visited Stallone's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, though someone had spray-painted Sarah across the granite in red letters that the city couldn't quite scrub away. The story lived on in small acts of remembrance, in the few people who still carried the weight of what they'd learned. Frank DeMarco had spent 30 years running from the truth, then died ensuring it would survive him. The man who'd helped build a lie had finally torn it down, trading his life for the chance to say what should have been said decades ago. In the end, that was enough. Not justice in any clean Hollywood sense. There were no triumphant courthouse scenes, no moment when good clearly defeated evil. Just an old man typing furiously while the world exploded around him, determined to finally tell the truth about a little girl who deserved better than the story they'd sold about her death. The desert wind carried that truth now, scattered it across the vast Nevada sky where it could never be buried again. Frank DeMarco was dead, but his confession lived on, ensuring that Sarah Chen would be remembered not as Stallone's publicity stunt, but as herself, a bright, curious 6-year-old whose only crime had been asking too many questions. That story stayed with everyone who heard it, as Frank had always known it would.